encouragement to see or hear or read about Christians that are faithful in their service for the Lord. Man, I'd like to go to places and see somebody sitting there that haven't seen for years, and they're still there serving the Lord. Man, it makes you feel good. Just makes you feel good. And you hear about people, 40, 50 years they've been Christians, and you hear about them, and it just is an encouragement. In Hebrews 11, that's encouraging to hear about Stephen being a man full of faith. Then there was Timothy. Man, a faithful guy if there ever was one. And it says his mother and his grandmother, Lois and Eunice. 2 Timothy 1 verse 5, the unfeigned faith. It's good to hear about these people. Their unfeigned faith. Over in Hebrews, the 12th chapter. Hebrews, the 12th chapter. Wherefore, seeing we are also compassed about with so great a cloud of witness, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. A cloud of witnesses watching. So we need to be faithful people for the Lord. Because of all the faithful who have gone before, let's be faithful. So, tonight, I'm going to consider 3 lesser-known faithful men of God and be encouraged because of their faithfulness. After we read a little bit about them, we're going to look at them and see what we can learn from these 3 less-known individuals in the Scriptures. How many know who I can't even say it now. Tychicus. Who is he? How many remember Tychicus? Don't you remember him? Boy, he's a good guy. Acts the 20th chapter, verse 4. One of the group that traveled with Paul on his 3rd missionary journey. He went with Paul, was a companion of Paul, and he's a living, active part of the evangelism and the establishment of the church. Great person. Helped establish the church. Tychicus. He was at the meeting with the elders from Ephesus at Miletus. In Ephesians 6:21 and 22, Paul sent him to Ephesus. Let's read that. Ephesians 6:21. 21 and 22. My pages stick together. But that ye also may know my affairs and how I do, Tychicus, a beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord, shall make known to you all things, whom I have sent unto you for the same purpose, that ye might know our affairs, and that he might comfort your hearts. Paul trusted Tychicus to go and talk to these people and tell them what's going on and encourage them in the Lord, because he was a faithful minister. And then in Colossians 4, verse 7. Colossians 4, verse 7. All my state shall Tychicus declare unto you, who is a beloved brother and a faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord, whom I have sent unto you for the same purpose, that he might know your estate and comfort your hearts. Paul trusted him to go to the Colossae, to the church there, the Colossians, and tell them what was going on, how the church was growing and what they were doing on their journeys. And then you turn to Titus, the 3rd chapter. Titus 3, verse 12. Whom I send Artemis unto thee, or Tychicus, be diligent to come unto me to Nicopolis, for I have determined there to enter. And so he trusted these 2 guys. One of them was Tychicus. He was going to send one of them. to tell what was going on and enlighten them and encourage them in the Lord. He was a trusted minister of the Lord and helped establish the church. He was the kind of man you could send and get the job done. Faithful minister. There it says in Ephesians 6:2 and Colossians 4:7 that he was a faithful minister of the Lord. Sent to make known all things. Acts 20 verse 27. It's a verse that we ought to all remember. It says, let's read it. Acts 20 verse 27. Whereunto I take you record this day, that I am pure from all blood of all men, for I have not shunned to declare unto you all the counsel of God. This guy could be trusted to tell him the whole counsel of God, all of it. Now, I've talked to people and preachers and teachers before, we just teach the positive part of it. Well, there's a lot of negative in this book too, and you got to teach that too. All the counsel of God. And Tychicus was known for doing this, teaching the whole counsel of God. He was sent to comfort their hearts, a real encouragement to the Christians. Sent to Crete to help Titus, faithful minister of Christ, who also declared unto us your love of the Spirit. The church at Colossae, he's a minister there. And Paul had heard of the faithfulness of the Christians at Colossae from Epaphroditus, a dear fellow servant and faithful minister. So good when a fellow Christian can speak good of the church. And when you go traveling around to different places, speak good of the church. Don't tell them all our troubles and trials and the wicked people that come to church and the hypocrites and everything else and badmouth the church. Speak good of the church. Talked about this faith and love and hope. You know, we're a family in the church, and you ought to speak good of it. And when you speak of the church, it shouldn't be, well, they do this and they do that. It ought to be, we do this and we do that and we believe this. And it's us and we, not they and them. We believe this, not they believe this. You're part of the church, the family of God. And Epaphras, he spoke good of the church. Talked about the love and hope and faith that they had. Colossians 4 verse 12. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ, salute you always, laboring fervently for you in prayers, that ye may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. He was a faithful minister, and he prayed for the Christians, prayed for the people. And that is so important. You are working for others in the Lord when you pray for them and their work in the Lord. Man, that's important. Praying for the saints. And sure, we like to give to the work in Pakistan and India and Russia and Ukraine and so on. But it's just as important to pray fervently for this work, for these works. Epaphras prayed fervently, laboring fervently in prayers. We need to pray for one another, and the Christians in other places, and the Christians here, like Epaphras did. He had a great zeal for the Christians back home. Nothing like home, is there? It just, you go and visit other congregations, and it's great and wonderful to visit with the Christians there, but it's always great to get back home. And he loved the people back home, and really appreciated the home Christians. You know, in Philemon, verse 23, Where's Philemon? Just a little short book in between these two stuck pages here. Verse 23. There salute thee, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus. Say hello to him. Salute him and think good things about him. My fellow prisoner, Paul calls him. So there's Tychicus and Epaphras and Gaius. In Acts 19, verse 29, he was traveling with Paul when he was detained for preaching against idolatry. He got the people mad because it cost them money. And these guys preached what was needed. And you read the sermons in the book of Acts and so on, and they knew their audience, and they fit their sermon to their audience. And these people needed to be taught about idolatry, so that's what they preached about. And they got detained and made the people mad, but they needed to hear it. And so Gaius and the rest of Paul's entourage that were traveling around preaching, they preached what was needed. They knew their audience, and they knew what they needed, and they preached it. And then you go on there in the book of Acts, next chapter, the 20th chapter, here he's still going on preaching and teaching and traveling with Paul. And he wasn't a quitter, Gaius. In Romans 16:23, we find out that Gaius practiced hospitality. He was the host for Paul. And Paul said he was my host. And in 3 John 1 through 6, let's read that. 3 John, verse 1 through 6. The elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth, behold, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Beloved, thou doest faithful whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers, which have borne witness of my charity, my love before the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. You know, Paul baptized Gaius, and so he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. And he referred to Gaius as his children in the Lord, and Paul trusted him, and it's so good to hear of the face of his faithfulness, and good to hear he was good to the brethren and to strangers. And there's a real contrast here in 3 John. Gaius, a great man of God, and Diotrephes, a malicious, destructive man. And so he says such nice, good things about Gaius. Gaius, his life and his teachings brought praise and glory to Christ and the church. And it made Paul glad. An interesting side note about Paul, he baptized Gaius, and Paul says he planted, and Apollos watered, God gives the increase. And we need to be like these three faithful ministers and spread the word. Now, just from personal story, years and years ago, Archie Word converted the Knight family. And I lived in Portland for a few months, and Archie Word was the preacher, and old Bert Knight, man, he was just a neat old gentleman. And after church on Sunday mornings, he'd want to take my wife and I out to lunch, and we just enjoyed it so much. Bert Knight, just a great old gentleman back then. Well, his son, Elston Knight, whom Archie Word converted, became a preacher. And he preached in Brookings, South Dakota, and converted my grandparents and my dad and my uncles and aunts, and 3 of them became preachers, and 1 of them married a preacher, and so on. And my dad became a Christian after Elston Knight taught him when he was a teenager. And my dad became a preacher. And he was preaching down in Sacramento, and there was a family of the Orsillos family, just a neat couple. And they had a teenage son named Alton Danielson. My dad taught him, and Alton became a Christian and became a preacher. Started preaching down in Stockton, and he met a fellow named Denny Martin, and he's preached here before. And Martin became a Christian and became a preacher and went to El Salvador and started churches in El Salvador. And you see the chain. Now, what if the Knights hadn't become Christians and moved to South Dakota? My dad might not have been a Christian. Or maybe if Alton Danielson hadn't been a Christian and passed the word on to Denny Martin, that church in El Salvador wouldn't have started. And you never know the results of today's actions. You know, you don't know the future results of today's actions. We need to be good ministers and teach and preach and win souls to Christ, because our latest brother in Christ is up here, sitting here on the second row. He could turn into just the best evangelist that this country has ever heard. He could. And win souls to Christ that you just wouldn't believe all the good that he could do. We don't know the results, the future results of today's actions. And we all need to just try to win people to Christ like these 3 guys did, and be good workers and ministers of the gospel of Christ. As you go about your everyday life, spread the gospel as you go. And when we were over in the other auditorium, we had a map of the world on the wall. It's back there in the hallway, and I kind of wish it was back up here. Read the paper, but lots of people don't read the paper anymore. And read about these places and hear about them and kind of know what's going on there. So when we pray, we can have intelligent prayers for these places. These 3 guys in the scriptures, they traveled all around pretty much the then known world and taught and preached. And we send people around the world, and we ought to know what's going on in their countries. We ought to know what's going on in the cities around our United States, so we can understand better what to pray for as you go. You know, that map that's hanging out there, Lee Turner called me one day and he says, I was just there in Reno, and you guys don't have a world map hanging anywhere in your church building. That's terrible. And so I said, okay, I'll see what I can do. He says, I'm going to help you along. He said, I'm going to send you a large world map, and I want you to hang it on the wall. So a few days later, here it came in the mail, and I made a frame, and it was on the wall, the front wall, out there in that other auditorium for a long time. And it was used. Right now, we're praying for the Christians in this country. And anyway, it's back there still, and I see it getting used once in a while. And so we ought to know what's going on around the world, and who we're praying for and why we're praying for them, and so on. And plan your trips and your vacations around the church and activities so you can be an encouragement to other congregations, just like these guys were encouragers and other congregations as they traveled. Prayer is an essential part of the world evangelism. So we labor in prayer. Pray knowledgeable prayers. All three, Tychicus, Epaphras, and Gaius, were faithful ministers, and we all should work in such a way that fellow Christians here and elsewhere will speak of us as faithful Christians. You know, people ought to realize that your church at Reno is a faithful congregation and believes the truth and teaches the truth. We ought to have that reputation. Matthew 5, verse 16, let your light so shine. And also we learn from these guys that you preach what is needed even when it's not wanted. Even when it's not wanted. You got to preach the whole counsel of God. These guys did. Ephesians 1:9, you please God, not man. Sure, people aren't going to like some things, but you still got to preach the truth. And this one you might not like so well. My daughter doesn't go to church. And one of the reasons that she doesn't is because of the hypocrites in this church. How she knows more about the dealings of this congregation than I ever thought of knowing. So how did you know that? Well, so-and-so's doing this and so-and-so. I can go to church with those kind of people. So how do you know that? Well, there's a little group of gossips here that tell her, and this doesn't help. And you get on Facebook and back and forth, and man, I just can't believe some of the about you people. How did you learn that? I didn't know that. The church is doing this, the church is doing that. I didn't know that. You know, we ought to speak good about the church and not talk about the problems that people have. These three preachers, ministers, talked good about the church. They talked good about the church. Sure, there's bad people come to church. But I'd rather go to church with a hypocrite than go to hell with him. Wouldn't you? So keep the business of the church in the church. You understand what I'm saying? You understand? Not Epaphras, and Gaius, and these guys, man, they talked good about the brethren. And sure, there's problems. We all got problems and heartaches and gut aches, and talk good about the church like these guys did. The wonderful brethren, faithful people, and the love of the brethren. Man, they're good guys. Talk good about the church. Talk good about the church. You're part of it. Talk good about the church. And say, we do this and we believe this and so on, not they. Preach what is needed, even when it's not wanted. Hebrews 12, verse 1 through 3. We have a great cloud of witnesses, a great many examples of faithfulness to follow. Wherefore, seeing ye also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us. Let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endures such contradictions of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. We have a cloud of witnesses, and we have brothers and sisters here in this congregation. We have brothers and sisters around the world speak good of the church and of Jesus Christ and be a good minister and do lots of praying for everybody, for fellow Christians. In 2 Timothy, one more verse I want to read, 2 Timothy 4, verse 6. For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. And not to me only, but all them also that love his appearing. Keep the faith, brethren, and you'll get that crown of life. It's waiting for you. Be a good minister like these three guys that we don't hear too much about very often. Be good ministers for the Lord and speak good of the church and the glory of God and Jesus Christ. We're going to sing a song tonight. Let's sing 345. 345. When the roll is called up yonder, I'm going to be there. You know, you ought to get it set in your mind. Back when God destroyed the world with a flood, only 8 people were saved. Only 8. And if that's the way it's going to be at the end of time, only 8 people are going to be saved. I'm going to be one of those 8. Now, I think there's going to be more. But if it's only 8, I'm going to be one of those 8. So there's 7 left for you guys.